It started with 3 trucks that didn't belong there. Not parked in a driveway, not on the street, not even halfway across the curb like most HOA violations. No, these trucks were sitting comfortably inside a private garage that wasn't theirs, as if they had always owned the space, as if permission was never required, and as if consequences simply didn't exist for people like her. The homeowner stood frozen for a moment, staring at the scene that felt too absurd to be real. The garage door was wide open, sunlight pouring in, revealing 3 oversized trucks wedged tightly inside, their tires marking the concrete like territorial claims. And standing just outside, arms crossed, sunglasses on, was the woman who had turned the entire neighborhood into her personal kingdom, the HOA president everyone whispered about but never challenged. She had that expression again, the one that said rules were for everyone else. There had been warnings before, notices taped to doors, fines slipped into mailboxes, passive-aggressive emails sent at midnight. She had built her authority piece by piece, feeding on silence and compliance. But this was different. This wasn't enforcement. This was invasion. The homeowner didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't even question her. Instead, something far more dangerous happened. He smiled, because in that exact moment, a plan formed. Simple, quiet, and devastatingly effective. No yelling, no legal threats, no dramatic confrontation. Just one action, one click, and everything would change.
Chapter 1. The Line She Crossed. The neighborhood had always looked perfect from a distance, the kind of place that gave the illusion of order, calm, and quiet success. Every lawn was trimmed with almost unnatural precision, every driveway clean, every mailbox aligned as if measured with intent rather than convenience. It was the kind of place where nothing seemed out of place, not because nothing ever happened, but because everything that did was quickly corrected.
That balance had kept things stable. Until the morning, everything changed. It began quietly, like most disruptions do. There was nothing unusual about the day itself. The sky was clear, the air still, the kind of morning that felt predictable in the best way. The homeowner stepped outside expecting routine, expecting normalcy. What he found instead didn't register immediately. The garage door was open. That alone wasn't alarming, but it was unexpected. He was certain he had closed it the night before. For a brief moment, he considered the possibility that he had simply forgotten, that it was nothing more than a minor oversight. Then he saw the trucks. 3 of them. Large, heavy, positioned with a kind of permanence that suggested intention rather than accident. They filled the space completely, leaving no room for interpretation. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. The sight alone was enough to disrupt the calm of the morning, but what stood just outside the garage made it undeniable. She was there, standing with the kind of posture that communicated ownership without needing to say a word, arms crossed, sunglasses in place, expression steady and unbothered. It was the same presence she carried during inspections, during warnings, during every interaction where she held the upper hand. Except this time, the setting was different. This wasn't a shared space. This wasn't a community area. This was private property. And she was standing there as if that distinction didn't matter. The homeowner didn't react immediately. There was a pause, a moment where observation took priority over emotion. He looked at the trucks again, then at the garage, then back at her. The situation didn't make sense, not in any way that aligned with logic or rules or even basic respect. But it made perfect sense in one specific context: control. Because to someone who believed they controlled everything, boundaries stopped being barriers and started becoming suggestions. And suggestions could be ignored. There was no apology in her posture, no hesitation, no sign that she believed she had done anything wrong. If anything, there was expectation, the silent assumption that this would be accepted the same way everything else had been. That was the moment something shifted. Not externally, internally. Because there is a difference between tolerating control and allowing invasion. And this crossed that line completely. Still, there was no immediate confrontation, no raised voice, no visible frustration. Instead, something far more calculated took place. The homeowner stepped forward, not toward her, but toward the garage itself. His movements were calm, deliberate, almost routine. If she noticed, she didn't react, because she didn't expect what was coming. He reached the control panel inside the garage. For a brief moment, everything seemed still, as if the entire situation was holding its breath without realizing it. Then, without hesitation, he pressed the button. The garage door began to move, slowly at first, then with steady momentum, descending from above with a quiet mechanical sound that felt louder than it should have. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight, because it meant something. As the door came down, the trucks remained inside, and for the first time, her posture changed. It wasn't immediate anger, not yet. It was confusion, a break in expectation, the kind of reaction that happens when reality doesn't align with assumption. The door continued its descent. Halfway down, the situation became clear. 3/4 of the way down, it became irreversible. And when it finally closed completely, sealing the trucks inside, the shift was undeniable. The space that had been taken was now reclaimed. Silently. Completely. There was no announcement, no explanation, no justification offered. Just action. The homeowner stepped back outside, the same calm expression on his face, the same controlled presence that had defined the entire moment. He didn't look for approval, didn't wait for a reaction. But the reaction came anyway. Because for someone who had built authority on the assumption of control, losing it, even briefly, wasn't something that could be ignored. The realization hit her all at once. The trucks were inside, the garage was closed, and she didn't have access. What had seemed like a simple, unquestioned decision moments earlier had turned into a situation she didn't control, and that was unfamiliar territory. Unfamiliar, and deeply uncomfortable. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, filled with tension that hadn't yet found its expression. The calm of the morning had been replaced by something else entirely, something that felt unstable, unpredictable. Because control had shifted, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through a single deliberate action, and that made it far more powerful.
The homeowner remained where he was, steady and composed, giving nothing away, offering no reaction that could be used against him. It wasn't passive, it was intentional. Because sometimes the most effective response isn't escalation, it's restraint. But restraint, in this case, didn't de-escalate the situation. It intensified it. Because without something to push against, her usual methods had nowhere to go. There was no argument to dominate, no resistance to overpower. Just a reality that didn't change no matter how it was approached. And that reality was simple. The trucks were inside, and they weren't coming out. Not yet. The balance that had existed in the neighborhood for so long had been disrupted. Not loudly, not publicly, but in a way that would ripple outward whether anyone intended it or not. Because moments like this don't stay contained. They spread through observation, through curiosity, through the quiet realization that something once considered untouchable might not be as absolute as it seemed. The homeowner understood that, even if he didn't show it. And somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the calm and the control, beneath the simplicity of the action he had taken, there was awareness. This wasn't over, not even close, because actions have consequences, and this one had just begun. The silence didn't last long. Chapter 2. The meltdown begins. Approximately 1,400 words. The silence that followed the closing of the garage door didn't settle into calm. It stretched, tightened, and transformed into something far more volatile. What had started as a quiet morning disruption was now evolving into a confrontation defined not by noise, but by imbalance. The kind of imbalance that occurs when expectation collides directly with reality and refuses to adjust. For a brief moment, she didn't move. The shift in control hadn't fully registered yet, not in a way her instincts could process. Everything about her posture suggested hesitation masked as composure, as if standing still could somehow undo what had just happened. But stillness, in this case, only amplified the truth. The trucks were inside. The garage was closed. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't dictate what happened next. That realization didn't arrive gently. It hit all at once. Her posture changed first. The rigid, confident stance that had once communicated authority softened into something sharper, less controlled. The tilt of her shoulders shifted forward, her weight leaning into the space between them, as if proximity alone could re-establish dominance. The sunglasses came off, not dramatically, but deliberately, revealing an expression that no longer carried quiet certainty. It carried irritation, then disbelief, and finally, anger.
Not the loud, explosive kind immediately, but the controlled kind that builds pressure beneath the surface, the kind that searches for an outlet, for something to push against, something to break through. But there was nothing to push. The homeowner hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he had been, calm, grounded, unaffected by the escalation that was beginning to form in front of him. There was no defensive posture, no visible tension, no urgency to explain or justify. If anything, his stillness made the situation feel even more unbalanced. Because calm in the face of anger doesn't neutralize it, it magnifies it. Her movements became sharper, more defined, a step forward, a shift in stance, subtle gestures that would have once carried weight, once demanded response. But now they seemed to hang in the air without landing, without impact. Because the situation had changed, and she hadn't caught up to it yet. There was an expectation, clear, unspoken, that the moment would resolve itself quickly, that the action would be reversed, that the door would open, that normal order would be restored without resistance. That was how things had always worked. But nothing was happening. Time passed in seconds that felt longer than they should have. The garage remained closed, the trucks remained inside, and the absence of reaction from the homeowner began to feel less like calm and more like control. That was when the shift accelerated. Her movements lost their precision. What had started as controlled irritation began to break into visible frustration, the kind that doesn't stay contained, that spills outward in ways that draw attention whether intended or not. And attention, in a neighborhood like this, doesn't take long to gather. At first, it was subtle. A curtain moving slightly in a nearby window, a shadow lingering longer than usual behind a glass door, the quiet presence of observation, careful and indirect, the way people watch something they're not supposed to notice. But curiosity builds quickly when something unusual happens in a place defined by routine. A door opened across the street, casually, as if for fresh air rather than a better view. Someone stepped outside with no clear purpose, pausing just long enough to observe before pretending to continue with their day. Another figure appeared at the edge of a driveway, phone in hand, attention clearly divided between the screen and the scene unfolding nearby. The atmosphere shifted. What had been private seconds ago was now becoming visible. And visibility changes everything, because authority, when challenged quietly, can still maintain its structure. But when that challenge becomes visible, when others witness it, process it, begin to understand it, that's when it starts to weaken. She felt that shift, not consciously at first, but instinctively. There was a growing awareness that this moment was no longer contained, that it was expanding beyond her control, not just physically, but socially. And that made it worse.
Her movements became more pronounced, less measured. The space between her and the homeowner felt smaller, not because he moved, but because she closed the distance, driven by a need to reclaim something that had already slipped. But proximity didn't change the outcome. The garage remained closed. The trucks remained inside, and the calm presence in front of her didn't break. That was the part she couldn't adjust to. Because control relies on response, on reaction, on engagement, and without those, the entire structure begins to collapse. The homeowner's stillness wasn't passive. It wasn't avoidance. It was intentional, in a way that made the situation feel even more one-sided. There was no argument to counter, no statement to challenge, no emotion to overpower. Just reality. And reality wasn't shifting. The tension built steadily, layering itself into the space around them.
It wasn't loud, but it was heavy, the kind of tension that fills silence instead of breaking it. More neighbors were watching now. Not openly, not directly, but enough to be present, enough to understand that something unusual was happening, something that didn't follow the normal pattern of quiet compliance. Because this wasn't compliance. This was resistance. And not the loud, confrontational kind. The controlled kind. The kind that doesn't escalate outward, but shifts the foundation underneath everything. She wasn't used to that. Her authority had always been reinforced by reaction, by frustration, by pushback, by arguments she could win simply by outlasting them. But this situation offered none of that. There was nothing to engage with, nothing to dominate. And that made her responses feel ineffective, which made them escalate further. The subtlety disappeared. What replaced it was urgency, the kind that shows when control starts slipping and there's no immediate way to regain it. Her posture became more animated, her movements sharper, faster, less contained. The space around her felt smaller, not because it physically changed, but because her control over it had. And still nothing changed on the other side. The homeowner remained steady, grounded, unmoved, not indifferent, but unaffected. And that difference mattered, because indifference can be challenged, but control, when it's quiet and deliberate, is much harder to break. The dynamic had completely shifted now. What had started as a simple assumption that her authority extended everywhere had been replaced by a clear, undeniable reality. It didn't. Not here. Not like this. The garage door stood as a boundary, both physical and symbolic. Behind it, the trucks represented the action she had taken without permission. In front of it, the situation represented the consequence she hadn't expected. And in between, there was nothing she could do to immediately change it. That was the moment the meltdown truly began. Not in volume, not in chaos, but in the realization that control, once lost, doesn't return instantly.
It has to be reclaimed, and sometimes it can't be. The neighborhood felt different now. Not louder, not visibly changed, but aware. Because once something like this happens, once someone challenges a system that seemed absolute, it creates a ripple. Small at first, barely noticeable, but impossible to contain completely. People were watching, learning, understanding something they hadn't fully realized before. That authority isn't permanent, that control isn't guaranteed, and that sometimes all it takes is one person to shift everything. The homeowner understood that, even if he didn't show it, because his actions weren't reactive, they were deliberate, measured, final. And as the tension continued to build, as the situation stretched further beyond what she could manage, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to resolve quickly. This wasn't going to follow the usual pattern. And most importantly, this wasn't something she could simply overpower, because this time, she wasn't in control. And the longer it stayed that way, the worse it was going to get. Chapter 3. The Neighborhood Watches, approximately 1,400 words. What had begun as a contained disruption was no longer contained. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where the situation suddenly became public, no loud announcement or visible escalation that drew a crowd. Instead, it spread the way tension always does in controlled environments, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly at first, until it was everywhere. The neighborhood had always operated on observation, not open curiosity, not direct involvement, but a constant awareness of everything that happened within its boundaries. It was part of what kept the system functioning. People noticed things, they adjusted, they complied, and when something unusual occurred, they didn't ignore it. They watched. At first, it was just a few, a figure lingering slightly longer than necessary at the edge of a driveway, a passing glance that turned into a second look, a routine walk that slowed just enough to gather context before continuing. None of it obvious, none of it confrontational, but enough to register. The closed garage door became a focal point. It didn't look different from any other garage in the neighborhood, but everyone who had seen what happened knew that it was. Behind it were 3 trucks that didn't belong there. Behind it was a decision that broke the pattern everyone had grown used to. And in front of it stood the aftermath. She hadn't left. That alone was unusual. Normally, situations like this would have been resolved quickly, either through compliance or escalation that forced compliance. But this was neither. This was something in between, something unresolved, something that lingered longer than expected. And lingering draws attention. Her presence shifted from controlled authority to visible frustration. It wasn't immediate, not in a way that could be clearly defined, but it showed in the way she moved, the way she held herself, the way her attention kept returning to the garage as if expecting it to change on its own.
But it didn't. Nothing changed. The homeowner remained consistent. That consistency became the anchor of the entire situation. While everything around it shifted, emotion, perception, attention, his position didn't. He didn't escalate, didn't engage in a way that fed the tension, didn't attempt to control how others perceived the situation. He simply allowed it to exist. And that was enough. Because reality, when left unaltered, speaks louder than any argument. The neighborhood began to process what it was seeing. At first, it was confusion. The situation didn't fit into any familiar pattern. Authority had always operated in one direction, downward, enforced, rarely questioned in a way that produced visible results. But now, something different was happening. Authority had been challenged. And not only challenged, it had been resisted successfully. That realization didn't spread through conversation. Not yet. It moved through observation, through small moments of recognition that connected silently between neighbors. A glance exchanged across the street. A subtle nod. The kind of communication that doesn't require words to be understood. Because everyone knew the same thing. This wasn't normal. And more importantly, it wasn't failing. Time played a critical role. Minutes turned into longer stretches, and with each passing moment, the situation became harder to dismiss as temporary. If it had been resolved quickly, it would have faded, categorized as a minor disruption, something unusual but not significant. But it wasn't resolving. The trucks remained inside. The garage remained closed. And she remained outside of it,